The wind over Larkwood Ridge always carried a different kind of silence. It wasn't the rural, peaceful quiet that lulled one to sleep, nor was it the hushed buzz of suburban order. No, it was a silence heavy with something unsaid, as if the hills themselves were holding their breath. Marvin Collins felt it every time he stepped onto the porch of his weathered house and looked down toward the sea of new homes that had flooded the lower valley over the past 6 years. They'd sprouted like engineered mushrooms, bright vinyl siding and factory-straight fences marking a wave of planned living that barely tolerated his kind. The old house built in 1962 stood like a rock. Cracked paint, rusted mailbox, a tin roof that echoed the rain. But Marvin never minded. What some saw as outdated, he called earned. It was the only place he and his wife Lorraine had ever lived in together, and he planned to keep it that way. Lorraine still planted marigolds along the driveway each spring, stubbornly believing that bright color meant something, hope maybe. She said things like that even when she didn't believe them. Her movements were slower now, but she moved with a kind of quiet defiance, like someone aware she was being watched but choosing not to flinch. Their grandson Elijah, 23 and halfway through a journalism degree he wasn't sure he even wanted, had come to stay with them that summer. Not out of duty, but because somewhere between the algorithms and the noise, he had a nagging feeling that something real was disappearing. He wanted to see where he came from before it was boxed, rezoned, and paved over. They were the last family on their stretch of road, not absorbed into the Neighborhood Development Authority, a private corporate entity that had bought up miles of land and converted them into identical hollow homes with homeowner guidelines thicker than the Constitution. It had been years since the offers began, always mailed, never signed, increasing steadily in value. Marvin read every one, sometimes twice. Then he'd toss them in the fireplace. Once a younger man in a silver Ford tried to talk in person. Marvin didn't say a word. He just walked up to the man's car window and stared. After a minute, the man drove away. For a long time, that was enough. The silence held. The house held. But this summer, the quiet shifted. It started subtly. A drone hovering too low for too long, a survey flag stuck into the edge of their driveway without explanation, then removed the next day. Lorraine found it unsettling. Marvin found it insulting. No one asked. No one warned. Then came the strangers, dressed casually but too clean, sunglasses that never left their faces, clipboards with no logos. One even walked into the yard without so much as knocking, muttering something about right of access, before Marvin let the dog loose. They ran faster than Marvin expected. Still, none of it crossed the line. Not really, it was pressure. Legal grazing. A chess game where Marvin refused to move his pieces, and that made him dangerous. Then, on a Wednesday morning at 6:37 a.m., a black SUV pulled up to their front gate. Unmarked, polished, tires too thick for that road. Marvin was already outside feeding the chickens, boots damp with dew and back stiff from a night that hadn't been kind. Lorraine watched from the kitchen window, her hands frozen above the sink. Elijah had just poured coffee when he saw Marvin straighten slowly and set down the feed bucket. The man who stepped out of the SUV wore a blue button-up, but his badge wasn't local. It was clipped to his belt, not displayed. His hair was buzzed close and his boots weren't civilian. He moved like someone who expected compliance. He didn't smile, didn't explain. He simply said, "We're here to do an exterior property compliance walkthrough. Should only take a few minutes. We've had reports." "From who?" Marvin asked. The man paused just long enough to say nothing. "We'll need access to the perimeter structures, fencing, drainage, and general visibility from the public path." "There is no public path," Marvin said flatly. The man looked at him for the first time. Really looked. Then he tilted his head and his hand brushed something on his belt. "Sir, you can comply voluntarily or through enforcement protocols." Lorraine opened the front door slightly. "What enforcement protocols? This is private land." He turned his body slightly in her direction. "Ma'am, if you're interfering with an active inspection—" "I called no one. We're not part of your authority," Marvin cut in. "You are adjacent to a managed community under chartered oversight. That includes access for visual confirmation of lot integrity," the man said, as if reading from a manual. Elijah stepped out onto the porch, not aggressive, just present. The man's eyes clocked him immediately. His hand went from belt to vest, and that's when Marvin saw it. The subtle twitch, the shift in breath. The man wasn't expecting witnesses. Or maybe he didn't care. "This isn't your place," Marvin said slowly, "and you're not law enforcement." There was a pause. Not hesitation. Assessment. Then the man stepped forward and said, with complete calm, "Sir, step back now." And that's when it happened. The man drew a sidearm. Clean motion, professional grip, no tremor. Not pointed directly at Marvin, angled low but unholstered. That was all that mattered. Elijah's voice broke the silence. "Put it down." But he didn't shout. He didn't grab a phone. He didn't run. He stood still. Lorraine, meanwhile, didn't scream. She didn't faint. She stepped back inside without a word and pressed the emergency call button wired into the hallway wall, the one they'd installed not for burglars but in case of heart attacks. It linked to a private responder service, not police, not 911. Something Marvin had paid for in cash and never told Elijah about. The man with the gun didn't know that. The sound came first, whirring from above. Then from below, a black Tahoe appearing behind the SUV, tires eating gravel fast, lights off. Two figures stepped out, both dressed in full tactical gray, no markings visible. The man with the badge turned, weapon still in hand, then froze. His lips moved and Marvin saw the panic flash across his face in an instant. He didn't just see enforcement. He saw recognition. He saw people who knew who he was and weren't surprised to find him there. He said one thing before they took him down. "I'm not here for them, I swear." But nobody was listening. Lorraine stepped back onto the porch. Elijah lowered his hands. Marvin didn't move. The silence returned to Larkwood Ridge, but it wasn't the same anymore. It carried a new weight now, something broken open beneath its surface. The past was no longer the only thing buried in that land. The next 48 hours passed like a fog pressed against the windows. Dense, opaque, impossible to separate into moments or conclusions. The black SUVs had disappeared just as quickly as they'd arrived, leaving behind nothing but disturbed gravel and the faint chemical scent of burned rubber. Lorraine washed her hands 6 times that day without touching anything dirty. Marvin didn't speak much except to answer Elijah's questions with short, measured phrases that somehow carried more weight than silence. He didn't explain who the men in gray were or why they hadn't worn badges or names. He didn't explain why the man who'd drawn a weapon had seemed more terrified by them than anyone else on the property. And he definitely didn't explain why, after the Tahoe left, another vehicle, a low-profile matte black sedan, parked across the field and sat there idling for 13 minutes before turning off its lights and backing down the hill. Marvin simply told Elijah to start bringing in the porch chairs at night and to keep the side gate locked even if they were home. Lorraine, on the other hand, made 3 phone calls the next morning. First to the utility company, then to the local assessor's office, and finally to the only lawyer she had ever personally known. Marjorie Thompson, a friend from their old church, now semi-retired but still practicing in civil defense. Lorraine didn't give details. She didn't have to. The tone in her voice was enough. Within hours, Marjorie had connected her with a compliance researcher, a man named David Lynn, based 2 towns over, who specialized in real estate oversight cases. David wasn't cheap, and he didn't work weekends. But he made time. He had, he said, received a few calls recently about oversight agents making unannounced entries into parcels adjacent to managed neighborhoods. Usually the calls came too late, after paperwork had already shifted hands, after lines had been redrawn. The story always began with someone ignoring mail they thought was junk, or not recognizing the difference between a community association and a chartered authority. But what made this different, David said, was the weapon. The report wasn't filed. Not by anyone. No charges, no citation, no media coverage, no record. Lorraine asked point blank if they were in danger. David didn't answer directly. He asked if they had a will and if they had any current copies of the property boundary survey. Elijah, meanwhile, had taken to watching from the attic with an old set of binoculars Marvin kept in a trunk labeled camping. He logged the vehicles that passed by. Most were normal. Mail carriers, delivery trucks, one guy on a motorcycle with a weed whacker tied across the back like a sword. But some vehicles came twice. One had a small white sticker on the back bumper with an upside-down triangle, Another had a dash-mounted camera pointed at the road, not the driver. Elijah marked every license plate. Marvin let him do it without comment. The real turning point came on the second evening after the standoff, when Lorraine went out to feed the cat and found a manila envelope propped against the side gate. It was sealed with clear tape, no postage, no name. Just their street number written in careful block letters. Marvin opened it inside at the dining table under the dim orange glow of the overhead light. Inside were 6 pages. The first was a notice of intended inspection, marked Post Facto Compliance Review. The second was a form stating that their lot had been flagged for visibility anomalies. The third was a photo of their house, taken from the East Hill, showing the roof line in the backyard. The fourth page was a map, altered slightly. Their property lines had been redrawn. The final 2 pages were legal language. A demand to appear for a preliminary procedural review within 7 days at an off-site location 20 miles away, signed not by a judge or official, but by something called the Regional Environmental Structure. Oversight Board. David Lynn said he'd seen that name before. It wasn't a real government body. It was a front, a shell, a licensing loophole used by private development interests to conduct what he called pre-clearance incursions. A term Marvin hated as soon as he heard it. It meant they were claiming the right to inspect his land, not because they had the authority, but because they were betting on him not having the resources or knowledge to stop them. Elijah wanted to go public, post the documents, leak the photos, reach out to local newsrooms. Marvin shut him down fast. "This doesn't get solved by shouting into the wind," he said. "It gets solved by knowing who's really holding the leash." That night, for the first time in years, Marvin slept with a loaded revolver in the nightstand drawer. Lorraine didn't ask. She just put a new bulb in the floodlight above the garage and reset the timers on the motion sensors. The next morning, Elijah found that the side gate had been left ajar, just enough to squeak when the wind pushed it. The latch wasn't broken. It had been unlocked from the inside. Marvin went to the shed and came back with a shovel and a crowbar. He didn't say what he was looking for, but he went straight to the old drainage trench along the southern fence line and started digging. Elijah joined him silently, and they worked for 3 hours in the sun. At first it was just rocks and clay, but then they hit something hard. A flat case buried just beneath a layer of gravel. Black, waterproof, military grade. Marvin didn't open it right away. He carried it inside, washed it down, and laid it on the kitchen table. Then he opened it slowly. Inside was a rugged tablet, powered off, and a small drive labeled RCO B2. There was also a folded piece of paper, handwritten instructions on how to access an encrypted server using the drive. Lorraine stared at the device like it was a snake. Marvin picked it up without hesitation and plugged it into the one computer in the house that didn't touch the internet. He didn't tell Elijah what he was doing, only that if anyone knocked on the door in the next 10 minutes, they were not to answer it. The screen blinked twice, then displayed a set of directories. Marvin clicked through them without hesitation, like he'd done it before. Lorraine sat down in the corner chair. Elijah stood behind him, silent. The folders were labeled with parcel numbers and time-stamped surveillance logs. One folder included internal memoranda from something called Urban Integrity Compliance Coordination, outlining staged code violations, manipulated inspection reports, and purchase offers timed to psychological pressure points. Death of a spouse, diagnosis of illness, seasonal stress events. Marvin closed the laptop and locked the tablet back into the case. That night, the wind changed direction. When Marvin returned to the porch after midnight, the field across the road was empty. But he noticed something different. His mailbox had been repainted. It was now the exact shade of beige used in the housing development across the ridge. A single flyer lay inside, folded neatly. It read, "Neighborhood harmony begins with mutual cooperation." Underneath it, in faint pencil, someone had written, "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Marvin didn't say much the morning after they found the flyer. He folded it precisely in thirds, slipped it between 2 pages of a property deed from 1983, and slid the folder back into the metal lockbox he kept under the floorboard in the hallway closet. Lorraine, who had been awake since 5, made coffee strong enough to peel paint and didn't speak until her second cup. Elijah stayed outside longer than usual, pretending to trim the edge of the lawn near the southern gate, but mostly watching the bend in the road where the trees parted, and the real world, the world beyond the house, began. Something had shifted, not in the documents or the threats or the creeping surveillance, but in the air itself, like they were no longer waiting to be left alone, but bracing for what would happen when they weren't. By early afternoon, they got their answer. The knock came soft but deliberate. 3 raps, followed by a pause, then 2 more. It was the kind of rhythm that sounded like a code, though none of them knew what it meant. Marvin opened the front door halfway and stared through the screen. A man stood there, not in uniform, not with a badge or clipboard, but with a camera slung across his shoulder and an expression like he already regretted being there. "Mr. Collins," he said. "My name's Brian Sorrell. I'm with the county's contractor oversight unit. May I speak with you a moment about a recent incident?" Marvin didn't blink. "County doesn't send reps without notice." "I'm not here on behalf of the county, per se," the man corrected quickly. "I'm under contract through their public liaison office as an independent assessor. I was asked to follow up on a field report related to improper conduct during a regulatory perimeter interaction." "You're about 3 days late," Marvin said. "I'm not here to investigate the incident itself," Sorrell replied. "I'm here to document any subsequent changes or alterations that may have been made to the property in response." At this, Marvin opened the screen door but didn't invite the man in. Instead, he stepped outside and let the door fall shut behind him. "You mind telling me who sent the report?" Marvin asked. "Not directly," Sorrell said, "but I can tell you it came from a recognized municipal development entity." "You mean one of the vultures that built those Legoland homes down the hill?" Marvin asked. Sorrell didn't smile. "I'm not at liberty to comment on partnerships." "Then we don't have much to talk about." But Sorrell didn't leave. Instead, he reached into his bag, not for paperwork, but for a small metal pole with a sensor on the end and a flashing blue light. "Then I'll just conduct my visual exterior audit and be on my way." He started walking the perimeter, scanning the property with the pole, like a utility worker checking for gas leaks. Marvin followed him 5 steps behind. "I'm going to have to ask you not to interfere, Mr. Collins," the man said without turning around. Marvin didn't stop moving. "I'm not interfering, I'm supervising." The audit took 8 minutes. Sorrell recorded data silently, muttering numbers and letters into a headset microphone. When he finished, he nodded once, offered a thin, "Thank you for your time," and walked back to his car. A gray hatchback with no plates, just a bar-coded sticker on the back window. Marvin stood on the porch until the vehicle disappeared behind the tree line. Lorraine stepped out beside him. That was the softest punch I've ever seen thrown. Marvin didn't respond, but his fingers tapped slowly against the porch rail. The real punch came that evening. Around 7:45 p.m., just as the sun had begun to dip behind the hills and the shadows stretched long and flat across the grass, the power went out. Not just a flicker, not a surge. A full stop, all at once. The lights in the kitchen died. The fan in the hallway stopped turning. The garage door locked shut with a metallic snap. Lorraine walked into the hallway and checked the breaker box. Nothing had tripped. Elijah checked the generator, still intact, still connected, still full of fuel. But when he tried to fire it up, nothing happened. No click, no hum, no resistance. It was dead, like someone had ripped out its soul. Marvin didn't say a word. He opened the gun safe and handed Elijah the old bolt-action rifle they used to use for coyotes. Then he lit the kerosene lamp they kept under the sink, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside. What he saw first wasn't light, but movement. 5 small figures, each carrying something, walking silently in single file along the far fence line. They moved quickly but without panic, coordinated like people who'd done this before. They didn't come up the drive. They didn't approach the house. Instead, they circled the far tool shed, placed something on the ground, rectangular, flat, with black casing, and disappeared into the brush without a sound. Marvin didn't follow them. He waited. 5 minutes, then 10, then 20. He approached the shed only after Lorraine tapped the window twice from inside, confirming no movement on the cameras. The device was a listening box, not a bomb, not a trap, a collector, with antennas and a signal receiver, designed to pick up vibrations and low-frequency audio. Marvin didn't touch it. He didn't disable it. He simply dug a small trench beside it, buried a chunk of galvanized steel under the earth, and left the device sitting there, confused and blind, collecting echoes of nothing. Later that night, when Elijah reviewed the footage, he noticed something strange. The men had entered from the north side of the property, through a section of forest that wasn't technically theirs but had always been unclaimed. It was public, overgrown, rarely used. Except now it had been cleared. Fresh tire tracks, trimmed branches. Someone had created a corridor straight through wide enough for a truck. And when he traced it back using satellite maps, Elijah saw where it led, to a small access road behind a construction depot, registered to a shell company based out of Delaware. The next morning, Lorraine went to town for groceries. When she returned, she found a blue tag taped to the windshield. Not a parking ticket. Not a warning. Just a message written in a careful, tiny lettering. Community cohesion requires cooperation. Be advised. Marvin read it once, then fed it into the shredder. At noon, they got mail. Inside the mailbox, now inexplicably repainted back to its original black, was a single envelope. It contained an official-looking letterhead from the so-called Regional Oversight Board, this time referencing a pending acquisition assessment, citing emergency jurisdiction under the Urban Containment Acceleration Act. The language was full of vague legalese, invoking the rights of transitionary property units and non-compliant holdouts. Attached to the letter was an offer, a buyout, generous on the surface but with a 30-day expiration, and a clause stating that failure to respond would be considered a waiver of protest. Marvin didn't shred this one. He read it slowly, twice. Then he folded it neatly and placed it under the leg of the kitchen table to stop it from wobbling. By sunset, he had made 3 calls, to the legal advisor, to David Lynn, and to a man named Jerome who hadn't been mentioned until now. Jerome didn't live in the area, didn't have a title, but Marvin gave him the coordinates of the shed and said only one sentence. It's starting. Jerome arrived the next day, not through the front gate or up the main road, but by foot, emerging from the northern tree line just after sunrise with a duffel bag slung over one shoulder and a deliberate gait that suggested he wasn't worried about being seen. He didn't knock, didn't call, didn't text. Marvin had told Elijah to expect someone, but hadn't explained who. When Jerome stepped into view, tall, dark-skinned, with sun-creased eyes and a silence that felt older than the trees behind him, Elijah just nodded and opened the side gate. Lorraine served him coffee in a chipped blue mug and asked no questions. Jerome didn't offer any answers. He unpacked his bag at the kitchen table. Maps, a satellite phone, 2 external hard drives, a binder filled with printed documents that looked like they'd been photocopied from records not meant for public access, and simply said, "I'll be here 3 days. After that, it's yours." The first day, he barely spoke. He moved through the house with the quiet efficiency of someone performing an audit, not just of walls and locks, but of the people who lived inside. He asked Elijah what time the lights usually came on and off, how often deliveries came down the road, whether anyone ever parked for more than a few minutes across the field. When Elijah hesitated or shrugged, Jerome didn't press. He just noted the gaps. Marvin followed behind at a distance, occasionally offering a grunt of approval or a gesture towards something Jerome hadn't yet checked. They understood each other without speaking, like 2 men who had once been taught the same language and never needed to update the vocabulary. On the second night, Jerome asked if Marvin still had the list. Marvin went to the hallway closet and pulled out an old shoebox labeled tax stuff that no longer contained anything of the sort. Inside were names. Neighbors, mostly, some still living nearby, others who had sold or disappeared quietly over the past few years. Each name was accompanied by notes. Dates, odd occurrences, visits from men in suits with no names, trucks idling for hours, dogs poisoned, security systems short-circuited. Jerome took the box, scanned the notes, and didn't say anything for a long time. Then he asked one question. "Who's still here?" Marvin gave him 3 names. Jerome nodded and wrote them on a piece of tape, which he stuck to the side of the kitchen cabinet. Later that night, they sat outside on the back porch, all 4 of them, watching the dark slope behind the property where the trees dipped into shadow. There was no moon, just stars and the soft hum of bugs and far-off tires somewhere down the hill. Jerome lit a cigarette, exhaled without apology, and finally spoke in full. "This isn't about your land anymore," he said. "It's about the corridor. Marvin stared forward. Lorraine looked down at her hands. Elijah furrowed his brow. "The what?" Elijah asked. Jerome tapped the ash off the end of his cigarette. "They're not just trying to buy you out. They're carving a corridor, north to south, straight through this county. Not for homes, not for parks, for control. Property, utilities, movement. They want total vertical. They push a family out, rezone, bring in a shell company, build a neutral use structure, lease it to a sub-agent, and install monitoring infrastructure. Not citywide, not federal, private, untouchable. No oversight because they built the oversight themselves." Elijah's voice caught. "Why here?" "Because here's where people don't read the fine print. Because here's where people don't ask until it's too late. And because here," Jerome gestured to the ridge behind them, "is the last blind spot in this entire strip." Marvin nodded once like he already knew. "The listening device," Jerome continued, "was a decoy. It doesn't matter if you bury it. They already mapped the acoustic signature of your land. Every fence creak, every dog bark, every time you sneeze, they logged it. They just needed time to link your habits to your weaknesses. But they misjudged one thing." "What?" Lorraine asked softly. "That Marvin Collins still knows how to read a pattern." The words hung heavy in the air. Marvin didn't smile, but his eyes narrowed slightly, not with pride, but with clarity. He turned to Jerome. "So what's next?" Jerome leaned forward, his cigarette glowing in the dark. "Next, we do what they don't expect. We play by their rules." He spent the rest of the night drafting false reports, fabricated requests for inspections, mock violations, digitally altered photos showing the house with infractions it didn't have. He created a trail. A trap. Not for the fake compliance officers or the clipboard men, but for whoever was laundering the authority behind them. On the morning of the third day, Marvin received a call from a number he didn't recognize. When he answered, a clipped voice on the other end said, "Mr. Collins, we've received your voluntary pre-clearance acknowledgement. We'll be arriving Tuesday at 10 a.m. to begin Phase 1 review. Please have your parcel access authorization posted visibly at the entrance." Marvin thanked them politely, hung up, and turned to Jerome. "You just invited them in," Marvin said. Jerome zipped his bag closed. "No, I invited them into a lie. Let's see how many of them believe it." At dusk, Jerome left the way he came, through the woods with no promise to return. Marvin didn't watch him go. He just went inside, closed the safe, and waited for the knock that would follow. The day they came back, everything felt staged. Not just planned, prepared, rehearsed, and timed down to the second. At exactly 9:56 a.m., a black truck with magnetic emblems on its doors rolled slowly up the gravel path to the Collins property, flanked by a second vehicle that looked more like a contractor van than a government rig. They parked deliberately aligned with the house but not blocking the exit. The driver stepped out first, a tall man in a light gray collared shirt with a laminated ID clipped to a retractable badge reel, the kind used at hospitals or airports. It swung slightly in the breeze but never flipped to show its face. He adjusted his sunglasses, looked up at the cameras mounted discreetly beneath the eaves of the house, and gave a small, calculated wave, as though he knew they were being watched but didn't care. Marvin watched from the dining room window, standing behind the curtains, hands clasped behind his back. He said nothing, even as Lorraine called softly from the kitchen to ask if they should lock the back gate. He didn't answer her. He just kept watching. Elijah stood behind him with a notepad, jotting times, license plate digits, even the make and tire tread of the vehicles, just as Jerome had taught him. The routine gave him something to do. It made the fear feel like part of the job. The man outside was soon joined by a second, this one younger, holding a tablet and scanning the exterior of the house, as if collecting environmental data. The third person, however, drew all the attention. She was large, imposing not just in stature, but in the way she moved. Assertively, with the kind of confidence that only came from having been obeyed too many times without question. She wore a thick tan blazer, sweat already blooming under her arms despite the mild weather, and her platinum hair was pinned into a bun so tight it looked like it might snap. In her hand, a glossy folder with visible tabs stuck out in multiple colors. She didn't speak as she approached the porch, but her expression suggested she was about to recite something unpleasant. At precisely 10 YDOs a.m., they knocked. Not a tap or a rap. 3 deep pounds like someone trying to wake the dead. Lorraine startled. Elijah reached instinctively for his phone, and Marvin exhaled through his nose, calm and slow. He opened the door only halfway and waited. "Mr. Collins," the woman said with a voice that was both syrupy and cold, like someone trying to hide disdain beneath protocol. "I'm Karen Bellman, Regional Director of Operations for the Civic Harmony Oversight Council. You've received our prior notices, yes?" Marvin didn't move. "I received something that pretended to be a notice." "Then you understand that we are here to conduct a Phase 1 infrastructure assessment per transitional ordinance compliance measures. You agreed to pre-clearance." "I didn't agree. Someone pretending to be me might have." Her face twitched. "Not much, but enough. Our documentation shows an affirmative response from your property's digital registry. If that was an error, we can proceed with visual-only entry pending escalation protocol." Marvin held the door steady. "You're not coming inside." Karen gestured to the younger man behind her, who immediately began circling the house again, now with a small, flat scanning device held chest-high. It emitted a barely audible click every 5 seconds. Lorraine stepped into the hallway, silent, arms folded. "Be advised," Karen continued, raising her voice just enough for effect. "Refusal to cooperate at this stage will trigger a non-voluntary review, with penalty accrual assessed per delay hour. We are authorized to collect environmental samples and conduct acoustic perimeter indexing, regardless of indoor access." "Take your samples from the ditch," Marvin replied. "Everything you need is already leaking out of your lies." Karen didn't respond to that. Instead, she reached into her folder and pulled out a laminated notice, thick and shiny like a restaurant menu, and stuck it onto the Collins door with pre-applied adhesive. The word non-compliant was written in bold red font above a barcode and a QR code. Beneath it, a line of smaller text, "Observation in progress. Do not interfere." They left without further confrontation. No threats, no arrests. Just that sticker, the drive-by data collection, and the sense that they'd just thrown the first rock through a very old window. But it wasn't over. That night, the sticker on the front door glowed faintly red under infrared, visible on camera but not to the naked eye. Jerome had warned about these. Passive trackers, silent data relays. Marvin scraped it off with a chisel, doused it in vinegar, and buried it beneath the compost pile. But by morning, 2 more had been placed. One on the water pump outside the garage, another inside the mailbox. Elijah found the third embedded in the tire tread of Marvin's truck. Lorraine made her decision that morning. She drove to the church she hadn't visited in months and asked to speak with a retired sheriff she once knew. He didn't handle property cases anymore, but he made a call. Quiet, off the record, and confirmed what she'd feared. There was no registered agency called the Civic Harmony Oversight Council. Their badges weren't logged with any municipal office. Their authority was self-claimed, validated only by contracts filed in sealed county archives, accessible only to co-signers. It wasn't a government op. It wasn't a local project. It was privatized, compartmentalized, and heavily shielded. The next evening, someone cut the fence. Clean, deliberate, and far from any camera. Marvin patched it with barbed wire and fishing line. He added motion-triggered alarms that didn't ring, but lit up specific bulbs inside the hallway, color-coded to the direction of entry. At 2:17 a.m., the bulb for the north fence lit blue. No one moved. Marvin stood in the hallway, hand resting on the old hunting rifle leaning against the wall. Lorraine waited in the kitchen, a flashlight clutched in both hands, pulse loud in her ears. Elijah was in the attic, watching the fields through night vision binoculars. They waited for the second light. It never came. Instead, at dawn, they found the sign. A wooden stake in the middle of the yard with a white cloth attached. Written in thick marker, just 3 words. "You're not safe." Underneath, pressed into the soil, were 2 black cards. Plastic, smooth, matte. Elijah picked them up with a paper towel. Both bore the same logo. A hollow triangle point down with a red dot in the center. On the back, a phone number with no area code. Marvin didn't call. He buried the cards beneath the chicken coop, and replaced the wooden stake with a steel rod wrapped in copper wire. 2 hours later, the sky over Larkwood Ridge filled with the low hum of a drone. Silent at first, then growing until it buzzed like something mechanical and angry. Lorraine stepped outside and saw it hovering just outside their property line, its lens trained on the house. It stayed for 17 minutes. Then it vanished, faster than anything its size should have moved. At dinner, Marvin said only one thing. "Tomorrow, we break pattern." And they did. They left the house at noon, something they never did, and drove not into town but to the office of a man Jerome had scribbled on a napkin. They brought copies of every document, photographs of the trackers, a USB of surveillance footage, and one of the buried tracker stickers preserved in foil. The man listened, didn't blink, didn't speak much. He wrote one sentence on a yellow notepad and slid it across the table. It read, "Do not go home tonight." The decision not to return home was made in silence, but it hung in the air with the weight of something final. Lorraine sat in the passenger seat of Marvin's truck with her arms crossed, not in anger, but in something more settled. Resignation or readiness, it was hard to tell. Elijah sat in the back, staring out the window, eyes scanning every intersection, every parked car, every pair of headlights that didn't move when they should. The USB stick, the foil-wrapped tag, the copies of every notice and photo, everything they had was now in the possession of a man whose name hadn't been spoken aloud since they left his office. He hadn't promised results. He hadn't even promised safety. But he had given them a word that still carried meaning. Witness. They spent the night in an old roadside motel on the edge of the next county, the kind with buzzing neon and paper-thin walls. Marvin kept the lights off in the room, preferring only the glow from the bathroom mirror, which he turned toward the window so no one could see clearly from outside. He didn't sleep. Lorraine dozed briefly with a blanket over her shoulders, sitting upright in a chair by the door. Elijah sat cross-legged on the bed with the curtains drawn, flipping through the photo logs on his camera. Just after 3 a.m., the motel's front lot filled with sound. Tires on gravel, doors opening, footsteps. But no one knocked. No one called. By morning, when they stepped outside, the only evidence anything had happened was a half-buried tire mark beside the rear exit and a cracked hotel ashtray left smoking on the ground. They returned home just before noon the next day. Nothing looked different from the outside. The gate was closed, the mail untouched, the chickens pecking at the far corner of the yard like nothing had happened. But as soon as Marvin stepped over the threshold, he knew. The stillness was too clean. The faint hum of electricity was off by a degree. The hall lights were turned to settings they never used. Lorraine walked into the kitchen and stopped cold. Her favorite ceramic mug, the one with the hairline crack she always aligned just so, was turned the wrong way on the counter. Elijah opened the basement door and found the chain latch disabled, its screw hole still warm to the touch. Whoever had come wasn't trying to hide. They wanted to be noticed, not seen. Marvin didn't touch anything. He simply backed out, nodded to Lorraine, and said, "Get your coat." They didn't run. They didn't pack. They just walked out the front door, closed it behind them, and drove down the ridge to the edge of the old utility access road where Jerome's signal relay had once been buried. The relay was gone, but in its place was something new. Metal, fresh, bolted into the dirt with a digital panel blinking green. Lorraine stepped forward slowly, crouching with care, and brushed the dirt away from its base. There was a wire leading into the soil. Thick, armored, industrial. She stood, took a photo, and said, "They're feeding data off-site." At that moment, Elijah's phone buzzed once, then died completely. He looked up alarmed and said, "They just pinged me. My location's off." Marvin didn't wait. He turned back toward the truck, but then came the sound. Low at first, then swelling. Tires, engines, 2 vehicles, then 4, coming from opposite ends of the ridge, closing in with practiced speed. Elijah dropped to the grass with the instinct of someone being hunted. Lorraine backed behind the utility post. Marvin stood still, calm, not hiding, watching. The lead SUV screeched to a stop just 10 feet from their bumper. The door flew open and out stepped Karen Bellman, blazer soaked with sweat, eyes wild and unfocused, mascara smeared at the edges of her temples like she hadn't slept. She held a megaphone but didn't raise it. She didn't need to. "You're in violation of containment protocols," she screamed, voice cracking. "This property is under jurisdictional override. You will be detained pending compliance review and evidence seizure." Behind her, men in body armor poured out of the other vehicle. No badges, no names, just black uniforms and masks. But they didn't raise their weapons. They didn't advance. Because across the field behind the Collins property, emerging one by one from the dense line of trees, came the real storm. Tactical units, marked, armored, federal. One voice, amplified by a professional-grade speaker from the tree line, rang out, "Stand down! Put your hands where we can see them! This operation is now under federal command!" Karen froze. The megaphone slipped from her hand and hit the dirt with a soft thud. One of the masked men in black looked at her, then slowly dropped his weapon and raised both hands, palms out. The rest followed. The field stood still. From the forest, 6 agents in dark blue fanned out, moving with calm precision, weapons holstered, badges displayed openly. One approached Karen directly and said something too quiet to hear. Her body tensed, then collapsed inward. Not a fall, just a slow deflation, like a structure giving up its frame. Marvin stepped forward only when the lead agent nodded toward him. The 2 men met halfway across the field, and Marvin extended his hand. "You filed it," the agent said, shaking it. "You did it right." "I just didn't delete anything," Marvin replied. Behind them, Lorraine walked forward to stand beside him. Elijah joined them a moment later, camera in hand, recording nothing, just holding it like a lifeline. The agent pointed toward the property. "We'll be here a while. You'll need to leave for a bit." Marvin looked at his house, then at Lorraine, and finally at the horizon. "I think we're ready." And with that, they turned away. Not defeated, not triumphant, but unbroken. 3 weeks passed before they returned. The grass had grown high in patches where it had once been neatly trimmed. The porch light was still blinking from its disconnected sensor, and the dirt path to the utility shed bore the deep twin marks of tire treads that didn't belong to any vehicle Marvin had ever owned. The house stood untouched, technically, no broken windows, no forced locks, but it felt different. It felt observed. Elijah was the first to step inside, walking slowly, filming each room not for social media, not for proof, but for himself, as if he needed to confirm that the rooms still existed in the shape they remembered. Lorraine moved more carefully, checking her cabinets, lifting rugs, running her hands along the edges of the kitchen counter, not expecting anything to be missing, but no longer trusting the stillness to mean safety. Marvin stood in the hallway for a long time without moving, staring at the hat rack by the door, the exact place it had always been, yet somehow wrong, tilted ever so slightly as if someone had bumped it on the way out and decided not to fix it. The federal team had done their job, dismantled the illegal surveillance infrastructure, identified at least 3 shell companies responsible for routing authority through fake compliance entities, and issued sealed subpoenas to a network of corporate contractors embedded inside county-level development boards. Karen Bellman had been taken into custody under charges that spanned obstruction, unlawful detainment, impersonation of a public officer, and conspiracy to defraud property owners across 2 states. Her silence in the weeks that followed was expected. She had too much to lose by talking, and too much invested to admit how little real power she'd ever had. The men in black uniforms, some former military, others security agents contracted through off-the-books partnerships, disappeared into sealed dockets and quietly vanishing LinkedIn profiles. No news stories were printed, no names were named, but the knock-on effect was unmistakable. The stickers disappeared from fences. The patrols stopped. The letters promising pre-clearance vanished. And around town, people who had once refused to make eye contact with the Collins family now crossed the street to shake Marvin's hand, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with words they hadn't planned, like, "I didn't know what to do," or "I thought you'd be gone by now." Marvin never said much in return. He'd nod, maybe say, "appreciate it," but his eyes never lingered. Lorraine was the one who smiled, offered coffee, told them gently that it wasn't about blame, it was about paying attention. And Elijah, once tempted to walk away from all of it, now spent his afternoons organizing digital files into dated folders, labeling every interaction, every printout, building a kind of informal archive, not to expose, not to accuse, but so that when Someone else came asking, someone uncertain or afraid. He could point them toward what had already been fought for. They repaired the fence together, the three of them, one slat at a time. It was slow work, but they didn't rush. Each nail was a kind of ceremony, not a return to normal, but a laying of claim. On the day they finished, Marvin climbed onto the roof and installed a small, unpainted sign. Just 3 words in hand-carved wood. Not for sale. There were no cameras watching anymore, not officially, but it didn't matter. That sign was for anyone who thought the ground beneath someone's home could be taken by strategy instead of courage. And for Marvin, it was enough. The land didn't forget, and neither did they. But it didn't own them either. They stayed not out of spite or fear or stubborn pride, but because they could, because someone had tried to make them believe otherwise and failed. And sometimes, when the sun dipped low over the ridge and the fields turned gold before dark, they sat together on the porch, said nothing, and simply listened to the quiet. The kind that didn't ask anything from them anymore.